Ethan Walker, the cold, untouchable billionaire at the top of the city, never imagined that one glance back could upend his entire world. A call from a nursing home, a girl whose eyes saw straight through him, and a quiet little garden would pull him from his silver throne to confront the one thing he feared most: falling in love, for real. The 58th floor of Walker Tower, where the sky meets glass, was Ethan Walker's world. From his office he could see the entire city below, a maze of streets, cars crawling like ants, and bright yet cold lights, much like his own life. Ethan, 36 years old, was known to the world as the emotionless genius, the youngest CEO in the history of Walker Global. Every step he took was watched by the financial elite. Every deal he closed was worth hundreds of millions. Every word he spoke could lift a company to the heavens or plunge it into the abyss. And yet, when the elevator doors closed, when the last footsteps left the office at midnight, Ethan was alone. In his lavish penthouse, there was a cold, black leather chair, a dinner no one waited for, a glass of wine sloshing in silence, and an emptiness no one saw. He'd once believed he didn't need anyone. Love, a luxury for the weak. Family, that had vanished with the pain of his parents' death in an accident, leaving him and his grandfather to quietly endure long winters together. But Ethan didn't allow himself to soften. He buried himself in work, turning loneliness into fuel, using success as a mask to hide the cracks in his heart. And he succeeded. Too well. Until that afternoon, when the phone rang. Not from an assistant, not from the board of directors, but from an unknown number. Ethan almost ignored it, but something made him pick up, perhaps because the caller ID read Sunrise Haven. "Mr. Walker, this is the head nurse at Sunrise Haven Nursing Home. I'm calling about Walter Walker's condition, his grandfather's name, the only person who'd held his hand through his parents' funeral. Who'd taught him to fish when he was a boy who didn't yet know how to tie a tie," tightened Ethan's chest. "What's wrong?" His voice was as stiff as ever, but his heart skipped a beat. "Nothing serious," the nurse said gently. "We just wanted to let you know the doctor adjusted his medication. He's fine, but lately, he's been mentioning you, asking why his grandson doesn't visit anymore." A second of silence stretched like a quiet storm. Ethan froze, his hands unconsciously gripping the phone tighter. He hadn't visited his grandfather in nearly 2 months. 2 months of meetings, deals, payrolls, stocks, but not a single check-in. "Thank you. I'll visit him soon." Ethan hung up. From a drawer, he pulled out an old photo. Himself at 10, sitting on a wooden dock by the lake, grinning ear to ear next to his grandfather. A quiet, warm memory like afternoon sunlight. That photo had once been a compass for his heart, but he hadn't looked at it in ages. That day, for the first time in years, Ethan shut his laptop while the sky was still light. He called his assistant. "Cancel everything tomorrow." "Sir, you have a meeting with the..." "Cancel it all," he insisted. "I have something more important." Ethan couldn't have known that tomorrow, at an old nursing home nestled in a peaceful residential area, he'd meet a woman who would change his life forever. But in that moment, he knew only one thing. It was time to return to the only place that still held the human part of him. The sleek black Bentley glided silently into the parking lot of Sunrise Haven Nursing Home, a fragment of a lavish world intruding upon a humble scene. Ethan stepped out, his charcoal gray suit impeccable, shoes polished to a mirror shine, hair combed without a strand out of place. He exuded the aura of someone who controlled everything. Wealth, time, people, even emotions. But at that moment he felt a rare loss of control. His heart beat unevenly, stirred by guilt, a feeling Ethan had long ago learned to bury. The nursing home lobby smelled of lavender and medicine. A middle-aged receptionist looked up, her kind eyes widening. "Mr. Ethan Walker, we didn't expect you today. Is that a problem?" His voice was sharp, a familiar defensive reflex. "No," she smiled. "It's just Walter is out back in the garden with Zoe." "Zoe?" Ethan frowned. The unfamiliar name struck like a dissonant note in the steady rhythm of his world. Zoe Mitchell, the care assistant. She's very close to him. Ethan gave a slight nod and followed the stone-paved path to the small garden out back. The air was cool and peaceful, with sparrows chirping in the treetops, and sunlight filtering through the leaves like streaks of memory gently falling to the ground. And then he heard it, his grandfather's laughter. Clear, warm, a sound Ethan had forgotten how much he loved. Walter was seated on a stone bench, an old book in hand, beside a young woman in a pale blue blouse. Her curly hair was tied back neatly, her skin sun-kissed. She was leaning down to adjust his pillow, her voice gentle and genuine, as if the world consisted only of the two of them and their quiet, nameless stories. Ethan slowed his steps. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps he didn't want to shatter that moment, or perhaps he didn't understand why this woman, who didn't even know who he was, felt so strangely unfamiliar to him. Walter called out, his voice brimming with surprise and joy. "My grandson's here." Zoe straightened up and turned. Their eyes met, and it wasn't the kind of look Ethan was used to. There was no admiration, no flattery, no hint that she recognized him as a man featured in Forbes, the ruler of a global financial empire. Just a pair of deep, quiet brown eyes, regarding him as if he were an ordinary visitor. "Hello," she said, her tone calm, almost neutral. "I'm Zoe." "Ethan Walker," he replied, pausing slightly. She nodded, her smile so faint it was barely there. Walter talks a lot about his grandson. For the first time in years, Ethan felt flustered. It wasn't because she was stunning in some glamorous way. It was because she didn't seem to care about impressing him. She didn't linger on the conversation, didn't compliment his youthful appearance or ask about his car. She looked straight at him, unfazed, unawed, unexpectant, and that oddly threw Ethan off balance. "I'm here to see him," he said, his voice carrying an awkwardness he'd never known. "That's great," Zoe replied simply. Then, turning to Walter, "I'll leave you two to catch up. Don't forget to drink some water." She turned and walked away, her canvas shoes silent on the brick path. But in that moment, Ethan found himself glancing after her. She didn't look back. "She's special, isn't she?" his grandfather said with a smile, catching Ethan's gaze. "Cold?" Ethan blurted out. "No, you've got it wrong," Walter replied. "Zoe's the only one here who sees me as a person, not just a patient to care for, but someone with a past, memories, a name." Ethan fell silent. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind like a distant drumbeat, and deep within him, something very small began to stir. The next day, Ethan returned to Sunrise Haven. This time he left the expensive suit behind. He chose a simple shirt and khaki pants, clothing he'd once deemed too ordinary for public appearances. But that morning, standing before the mirror, he'd hesitated at the sight of his usual vest, perhaps because he didn't want to step into his grandfather's world and Zoe's, wearing his familiar cold shell. He told himself he was there for his grandfather, but deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. The garden at Sunrise Haven wasn't large, but it brimmed with life. Neat rows of vegetables, the scent of damp soil, occasional laughter echoing from some corner. At its heart stood an old oak tree, its trunk broad as if embracing the memories of generations. And there was Zoe, crouched down, hands muddy, tenderly tending to young tomato plants. Ethan approached and cleared his throat lightly. She looked up, her dark eyes glinting in the sunlight. No surprise, no delight, no awkwardness. Just a calm gaze, still as a windless lake. "Hello again," she said, brushing her hands on her pants. "Hi," Ethan replied. "Where's my grandfather?" "Reading in the common room. He said his legs were tired today, so he asked me to water the plants for him." Ethan glanced at the tomato patch, then at her hands buried in the soil. He'd never understood why anyone would find joy in getting so dirty, but something about her piqued his curiosity. Not the kind that sought to conquer, but the kind that yearned to understand. How long have you worked here? Almost 3 years. And this garden? It's a community project I started with some friends. We grow clean vegetables to donate to struggling families and local charity kitchens. Ethan fell silent. He didn't know what to say. In his world, every project was tied to profit, KPIs and sponsors' names etched on golden plaques. Yet Zoe simply said, "So people can have vegetables to eat." "Want to try?" she asked suddenly, handing him a small seedling. "Me?" Ethan stammered. "The soil doesn't bite," she said with a smile, her eyes flickering with a subtle tease. Ethan hesitated, then knelt down. Feeling utterly clumsy, he dug a hole too deep, nearly snapping the tender stem. Zoe leaned over to guide him, her hand brushing his lightly, a fleeting touch, but enough to make his heart skip a beat. "You're in business, right?" she asked as he fumbled with a second plant. "How'd you guess?" "The way you look at things, like you're appraising them." Her words stopped him cold. There was no malice, no flattery, just truth. He didn't respond, just kept planting, head down. For the first time, Ethan felt a need to prove something, not with words, but with actions. With each handful of soil he pressed down himself. Day by day, Ethan started coming back more often. Sometimes he brought pastries for his grandfather. Other times he asked Zoe about the garden. He didn't realize he was changing until Daniel, his assistant, called him one early morning. "Sir, the stocks are up, but the investors want to meet soon to finalize the new roadmap." "I'm busy," Ethan said, his eyes still following Zoe as she lifted a small crate of soil under the tree. "I have something more important." Daniel went quiet, and Ethan knew he was shocked. In Ethan's world, something more important than money was almost unthinkable. That afternoon, as Zoe washed her hands at the spigot, Ethan approached again. "I did some research," he said, "about your garden project. I think with the right investment it could scale. Become a system. Maybe partner with schools or other nursing homes." Zoe turned, her gaze probing. "And you'd fund it?" "If you'd like." "No," she said calmly. "I don't need a big sum of money. I need people who genuinely care, who'll get their hands in the dirt." For the first time in his life, Ethan didn't feel rejected. He felt challenged. And he knew this wasn't just about the garden anymore. It wasn't just about his grandfather. It was about her and the things in her. Simple, quiet, yet stirring his heart for the first time in ages to want to reach out. When Ethan invited Zoe to Walker Global's annual charity gala, he didn't expect her to agree. But after a suspiciously quiet moment, she gave a slight nod and said, "If that night helps someone get an education, I'll come, but I'll pick my own dress. And I'll drive myself." Ethan smiled, not daring to admit that his heart had skipped a beat over such a simple nod. That evening, the Grand Plaza Hotel glowed with lights. A long red carpet stretched from the entrance to the Grand Hall, where the city's elite, politicians, tycoons, designers, celebrities, gathered in meticulously staged opulence. All eyes turned to Ethan as he arrived, impeccable in a hand-tailored tuxedo from Milan. But when Zoe stepped out of her beat-up sedan, wearing a borrowed navy dress, her curly hair loosely pinned up, the noise seemed to fade. No one said it aloud, but it was clear she didn't belong here. Ethan looked at her and smiled faintly. "You're beautiful in a real way," Zoe whispered back. "And you look like you're about to take me to someone else's wedding." Her words made him laugh, though his chest tightened slightly. He offered his hand and Zoe placed hers in his, hesitant, but she didn't pull away. In the ballroom, curious glances and whispers behind champagne glasses began to ripple. Someone murmured, "Who is she? Not Victoria, is it? Probably just a fling." Ethan ignored them. But Zoe felt every stare slicing through her like a cold blade. Early in the gala, Ethan introduced Zoe to a few colleagues, including Victoria Caldwell, the stunning board member who'd once been his potential partner in every sense. Victoria shook Zoe's hand, her lips smiling while her eyes scrutinized. How special that Ethan brought someone like you. Caring for the elderly and managing stocks are very different worlds, aren't they? Zoe returned a paper-thin smile, just like caring for people and caring for egos. Ethan nearly laughed, but when Zoe turned away, he caught a flicker of sadness in her eyes she hadn't managed to hide. When the first song played, Ethan extended his hand to invite her to dance. "You don't need to know how, just follow me." Zoe hesitated, but then she let herself be swept into his arms, warm, steady, and strangely dependable. "Do you do this often?" she asked. "Galas? Yes. Dancing with someone I don't want to let go of? No." Zoe gave a small smile, but her eyes didn't quite light up. She asked softly, "Are you sure you're not playing a role?" Ethan met her gaze. "With you, I've never acted." But then a familiar voice cut through the moment. "Ethan, the governor wants to discuss the downtown project." It was Victoria, again, standing nearby, her eyes like cold steel. Ethan glanced at Zoe. She had already let go of his hand before he could decide. "Go," she said quietly. "It's important." He hesitated, but he turned away. When he returned after more than 20 minutes, Zoe was gone. He searched the ballroom, the hallways, the courtyard. Nothing. His phone lit up with a message. "Thanks for the evening, but I don't belong here. Good luck with your world." Z. Ethan's heart sank into a void. He called her. No answer. Texted her. No reply. "She's gone?" Victoria's voice sounded behind him. Ethan turned, his gaze colder than ice. "What did you say to her?" Victoria shrugged, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Just reminded her some worlds don't mix, and that in the game of power emotions come second." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, then said something he hadn't expected of himself. "Then I choose second, because it's the only thing keeping me human." That night, as the city sank into its lights and hollow laughter still echoed in the grand hall, Ethan drove home in silence. The night wind blew through the window, but it couldn't sweep away the emptiness inside him. He'd once believed there was nothing he couldn't reclaim with enough money, power, and determination. But for the first time, he understood. Some things slip away just because you turn your back for a single moment, and the name of that thing was Zoe. For a week after the gala, Ethan didn't see Zoe. Not at the nursing home, not in the garden, not on any path he'd ever seen her walk. She vanished as if she'd never been part of his life, except that everything in him still carried her presence. The simple navy dress, those eyes, both fierce and fragile, the light touch of her hand like a breeze that shook his entire world. He'd lost many things in life, his parents, his childhood, his trust, but this was different. He'd lost a chance at love, and that was something he couldn't let happen again. The Walker Global Board meeting that Monday morning began with a heavy silence. At the head of the table sat Victoria, radiant like a victorious queen, her eyes glinting with subtle smugness. "Before we start," she said, "I'd like to propose something regarding the appointment of a temporary co-CEO, given Ethan's recent signs of distraction and prioritizing personal matters over work." A few members nodded, some looked away. Ethan sat still, hands on the table, eyes fixed on Victoria, as if seeing through every word she spoke. "You care about the company?" he asked softly. "Always," Victoria replied. "Unlike you, I don't disappear to chase new hobbies." This time, Ethan stood. "Then let me be clear, I haven't been absent. I've just found something that makes me want to make this company better, and it's not for profit." He stepped to the head of the table. His voice wasn't loud, but each word was carved like stone. "We've forgotten why this company was founded. My grandfather, Walter Walker, didn't build Walker Global for people like you to siphon fame and benefits. He believed in social impact. And now? So do I. A board member spoke up. What caused this sudden change? Ethan smiled, more genuine than ever. A girl. No, a woman, who taught me that not everyone sees value in numbers. She sees people, and because of her, I saw myself again. Victoria smirked. And what is she? A caregiver? A community gardener? You think someone like that belongs beside the CEO of a billion-dollar empire? Ethan's gaze turned icy. Far more than those who wear masks their whole lives but never truly love anyone. The room fell silent. Then he continued. I won't abandon this role, but if you don't want me leading Walker Global with a heart, vote me out. I'll accept it. I won't apologize for changing. I only regret not doing it sooner. That afternoon, Ethan went to Maya's house, Zoe's sister. Standing at the door, he held a bouquet of wildflowers, his heart pounding like he was a teenager in love for the first time. Maya opened the door. She looked at him, one eyebrow slightly raised. She doesn't want to see anyone, she said curtly. I'm not here to ask to see her. I'm here to say what she needs to hear, even if it's through this wall. Maya paused, then stepped back. She's listening. Ethan stood in the hallway, the sunset casting gold across his shoulders. Zoe, I've lost so much in life by staying silent, but I won't lose you that way too. His voice caught slightly, raw with honesty. I didn't know what love was until you looked at me like I was just a person, not a CEO, not a millionaire, just a man needing to be touched, understood, forgiven. Silence lingered beyond the door, but Ethan pressed on. I can't promise I'll always get it right, but I promise to love you. With everything I have left, I won't lose you over a gala, a cruel word, or a world I don't want to live in without you. He set the flowers on the doorstep. You don't have to come out, but if there's even a piece of your heart left for me, open this door. Not because I'm Ethan Walker, but because I'm the first person to know, without a doubt, that you're the most beautiful thing my life has ever touched. The hinges creaked. Zoe stood there, eyes red, hair disheveled. She said nothing. She just stepped forward and hugged him tightly. And in that moment, in the modest hallway of a humble apartment building, Ethan knew he'd reclaimed what he'd once lost, his own heart. The community garden buzzed with more life than usual that late weekend afternoon. Long wooden tables lined up close together, draped with red and white checkered cloths. The scent of baked goods, wild daisies, and children's laughter mingled in the air, as if the world had paused its worries for a moment. The summer festival, originally a hasty idea tossed around during a garden meeting, had blossomed into a celebration that bound the community together. Everyone contributed something: vegetables, pastries, an old guitar tune. But the most special thing of all, no one knew what was coming, except Ethan and Zoe, who hadn't the slightest suspicion. He'd been planning it for 2 weeks, quietly, every detail, every person, every step. And now, as she busied herself helping kids craft masks from leaves, Ethan stood at a far corner of the garden, his hand gripping a small box in his pocket, his heart pounding unlike any deal he'd ever closed. You're about to do the dumbest thing of your life, Walter, his grandfather said, clapping Ethan on the shoulder from behind. Sounds a lot like you, Ethan replied with a faint smile. Propose to your grandma at a bakery next to a gas station. Walter chuckled hoarsely. Because I couldn't wait till nightfall. Did she say yes, without a second thought? Didn't ask why, just smiled and said, why not? Like she always trusted her heart over her head. Ethan looked toward Zoe. She was laughing. That same smile, not dazzling, but enough to warm his heart all day. I hope she trusts me like that. You just trust this. Walter gripped his grandson's hand. Real love doesn't need a perfect plan. It just needs to be honest. As the sky softened into dusk, Zoe walked toward the resting benches beneath the garden's largest tree, where Ethan stood, quietly waiting. "What are you hiding over here for?" she teased, a few strands of her hair catching the sunlight. "Waiting for you," Zoe frowned, about to reply when Ethan dropped to one knee before her, gentle but resolute, as if his entire life had been leading to this moment. She froze. Ethan pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a simple ring, its clear stone gleaming like a dewdrop at dawn. Unassuming, unpretentious, just her. "Zoe Mitchell," he said softly. "I've been lost for years. Thought I was strong being alone. Thought I was steady needing no one. Then you came, and every reason I had crumbled, and strangely, I felt relieved." A breeze rustled through, carrying tiny petals swirling around them. "I won't promise to be a perfect man," Ethan continued, "but I promise to love you the truest way I know, whether in a boardroom full of suits or a garden full of dirt. You're the only choice I want to walk with to the end." The garden seemed to hold its breath. Zoe pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes welling up. She'd never imagined herself, a simple girl without fame or flash, could be where someone like him found home. Her voice trembled, "not made for glamorous worlds." "I know. And I'll never like galas. I've hated them since you weren't there." A choked laugh escaped her. Zoe nodded faintly. "Then why not?" She extended her hand. Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, his own hand trembling slightly, as if afraid one wrong move might dissolve the moment. From behind, applause erupted. Maya was the first to cheer loudly. Walter wiped his eyes while pretending it was an itch, and the garden burst alive as if they'd all just witnessed spring blooming in the middle of summer. Ethan stood, pulling Zoe into his arms, a complete embrace, no distance left between them, and as he kissed her forehead, ever so gently, he thought to himself, "This is the first investment in my life that doesn't need a profit report, just love." 2 months after the garden festival, Ethan was no longer the man whose mere nod once sent Wall Street into a frenzy. He was still the CEO of Walker Global, still wore a white shirt each morning, still held meetings, still made decisions, but something had shifted. Noticeably so, if anyone cared to look with eyes that could feel. In the once cold glass office, a small watercolor painting now hung behind Ethan's chair, a scribbled sketch by his grandfather Walter, depicting the two of them fishing, a gift Ethan had once chuckled at, but now it touched his heart more than any multi-million-dollar contract. And even more striking, beneath the corner of his desk sat a tiny potted plant, its first leaves just sprouting, planted by Ethan's own hands on a rainy afternoon under Zoe's surprised gaze. "You actually planted it." "Can't just plant people," Ethan grinned. "Gotta plant roots, too." Under his renewed leadership, Walker Global unveiled an unconventional strategy, reinvesting in the community, not with grand speeches or dazzling figures, but with small, real, practical steps. School food gardens, free vocational training centers for struggling teens, scholarships based not on GPA but on circumstance. "We're not saving the world," Ethan said in an interview. "We're just starting over from the roots." When asked what sparked this turning point, he smiled and said, "A garden, and someone who believed in it." Zoe never craved the spotlight. She kept her job at the nursing home, still wore her old hat each morning to the garden. But now, when someone asked why love a CEO like him, she'd just smile, because he knows to clear the soil before planting, and isn't afraid to get his hands dirty to nurture life. One late autumn afternoon, Ethan came home earlier than usual. Their apartment, once a sterile expanse of stone and glass, now brimmed with laughter, greenery, and the warm scent of baking. Zoe sat on the floor reading to Walter, who still hid his reading glasses to maintain his youthful air while a wool blanket draped across their knees. Ethan leaned against the doorway, holding a thick file, plans to expand the community garden system to 10 more cities. "Trust me?" he asked, as Zoe looked up. "I do," she replied without hesitation, "even though I haven't mastered watering plants yet. As long as you water with your hands, not a checkbook." They laughed. Then Ethan stepped forward, sat beside her, and rested his head on her shoulder, as if his entire busy life had been a prelude to this moment. Outside, the sky dipped into dusk. The day's last light gilded the small balcony garden where Zoe tended new vegetable sprouts. Ethan gazed at the tiny leaves and asked offhandedly, "Think they'll survive?" "They will," Zoe said gently, "because this time we planted them with love." Ethan squeezed her hand in his, and in that moment he understood. Success wasn't in numbers, but in who you chose to stand beside when the world grew quiet. And happiness was simply having someone place their hand on your heart and stay. When a man who thought he had everything meets a woman who only needs him to be himself, that's no longer just love. It's what makes his whole life begin again, the right way.